what happened now was, in history, around 1863, a problem occurred. Around the 1860s, Navajos had a reservation. They owned land. They had farming areas. They even had beautiful mineral rights. But settlers were coming in. Remember in the 1860s? So the settlers start coming in, right? And they start putting their cattle on Navajo land. They start mining Navajo riches. And the Navajos turn and they say, you know what? We're going to go back to borrowing from them. They're going to take our land and not pay us for it. We're going to go in and borrow some of their things because it belongs to us. That's the way they felt. Now in Washington, you have to understand, for years we've been doing this. Name tag. Name tag is a common experience for the American people. We've done this all the time. Name tagging is when you create a name to make it sound better or look better, or produce an effort to convince people this is the right thing to do. Some great name tagging was the Great New Society. That was deal with Great New Society, dealt with creating welfare. But we sold it under the Great New Society and the name tag. It worked. Take a look at subprime mortgage. Great name when it started out. Today it's not such a great name anymore, but it was a great name tag when it started out. Subprime mortgage means you get the loan for less. But you see, with every name tag, there's a good thing and there's a bad thing with it. And when you look at it, name tags sometimes convince people in the wrong way, because it convinces them sometimes that what their name tag isn't really telling about all the problems. When we go to Washington in the 1860s, the Navajos nation is being invaded. They're a whole nation, all their land. Now you might say in Washington we might name tag that, you know, to create a law saying, you know, preserving Navajo territory law. That would be a good tag. But you have to understand, in America we don't want our settlers to stop because we have a Navajo reservation in the way. We want settlers to go west. So we don't call it Invasion of Navajo Territory Act. We call it an Indian Problem Act. The Indian problem was, and here's a name tag, they weren't self-sufficient. We have to solve the Indian problem, so we send them to Redondo, Fort Redondo, 300 miles away. We take their territory away, we put them on a reservation. We make them walk 350 miles. We don't provide any transportation. Many of the elderly and young died on the way. Finally get to Fort Redondo, but our government has great intentions. It's called foreign aid. Today, you know what foreign aid's like. We gave several $1 million to Egypt. The next day they burned our flag. I couldn't figure out how that worked. But don't think we didn't make that mistake way back in the 1860s. You see, my dad says history repeats itself. We had great intentions when we give aid to foreign countries. We had great intentions for the Navajos. We said we're going to give them food to get started. We're going to give them blankets. We're going to give them a new sheep. We got the sheep from France. It's a sheep that's got wool and it's got a lot of meat on it. We're going to give them that sheep. And we're going to give them commercial looms, because at that time, you have to understand, industry is starting, and in comes the Hudson Bay Company, and a lot of Eastern companies are now making making blankets, wool blankets, more water repellent, cheaper. Doesn't take 3 months to make this. It takes a week at the most. And they're pumping these blankets out one right after the other. So now the Navajos aren't independent anymore. Their main source of income is they got outsourced. We know what outsourcing is. History repeats itself. You have a product that somebody can do cheaper and better, they're going to beat you in the market. Well, that's what happened to the Navajos. These blankets became very popular. The demand for Navajo blankets at Redondo wasn't. So what happens to all this beautiful ideas? We're going to give them self-sufficiency, we're going to give them agricultural equipment, we're going to give them all these things. Well, they sent it all over. And you have to understand, as a train leaving the east starts and stops at a lot of these towns. Each town looks at this train and sees all this meat sitting there. The Navajos don't need all that meat. So they decide that, you know, since they're passing their town, they're entitled to some of it. So by the time to train a rise at Fort Redondo to support the Navajos, the meat is tainted, most of the blankets are gone, the farming equipment nobody wanted arrives, and this stupid loom thing that nobody wanted arrives, and these sheep from France. Now here's what happens. You can't sell a blanket when you're in competition, so you have to lower your prices. So now they're asking the Navajos to work for next to nothing. They bring these sheep in with their other sheep. Now remember, their sheep way back there were merino wool. Those sheep were designed for what? Wool only. The French sheep was designed for food. Their wool is short and oily and unusable. And the Navajos don't realize mixing these two sheep together gives you an offspring where you have bad wool and bad meat. So now you destroyed their wool. They can't make their blankets. They're getting outsourced. And they bring them farming equipment. Well, farming equipment at Fort Redondo is like going to the Mojave Desert and trying to grow crops with no water. Useless. So here are the Indians. They have this commercial machine to make blankets. And they said, you know, if you use these commercial machines, you're going to be able to compete. We're going to give you these mechanical looms that you can just watch it, and we'll show you how to use it. A month later, they saw the machines thrown away. Why? If you're going to compete, you got to use them. But the one thing they didn't understand was the cultural difference and the mindset of the Native American. I want to go to this blanket. It's a later blanket, but it tells the story of what the Indians felt about their blankets. You see, when you go into a commercial business, there's no feeling about how wonderful a blanket can be. There's no emotion to it. It's just watching a machine going back and forth, putting the blanket together. There's nothing to it. But the Native American felt very, very, very emotional about their blankets. They feel that when they made a blanket, some of their spirit was in that blanket. And they believed that when they sold a blanket, they needed a place for that spirit to go back to them after they put their soul and heart into a blanket. And so they created what's called a spirit line. This is not a mistake. This is a spirit line. This is a way for the spirit, whoever made this blanket, who put their heart and soul into it, to get their heart and soul back. Can you see why a mechanical machine to make blankets did not work with the Navajos? And why we sometimes think we're doing really good in our foreign aid program because we're doing it from our heart, thinking that it's going to turn out well, they're going to be self-sufficient, we're going to give them things. What happened was the market fell out, they didn't like the mechanical looms, and so what took place was they could only sell their blankets by the pound, because now they got this oily wool that sticks, low-grade wool, and they're making blankets out of bad wool. So they're selling by the pound. So guess what they do? They don't clean the wool. Why? Because you clean it, it becomes lighter. You don't want a light blanket when you're being paid by the pound. In fact, what some of the Navajos did is before they started their blanket, they would take that wool that was oily and roll it in the sand. Why? Gain weight. So during this period, you have oily, dirty blankets by the pound. Still, some of the older Navajos are still creating beautiful blankets during this time with what they have. But the majority of them are starting to sell blankets by the pound because that's all they can do. Now their young people are looking at it and they're saying, you're spending a month doing an oily, dirty blanket, being paid by the pound, which is next to nothing. I'm not interested in learning how to make blankets. That business is dead. And so the young people wouldn't learn. So the art of building blankets was dying in the 1860s when you start seeing these blankets come out. No demand for them, commercially outsourced, can't build them cheaper, Then they had the problem of the sticky wool they got, where they were living. Finally, they were let to come back to their land later on because the program literally failed.